my recommendation is that you go on mute until you have something to say. And that way we won't have any background interference of any kind. Hello, Bob. Yeah, so, you know, it's as soon as I give the rules, Bob comes in, you know? So, anybody have any questions about our Torah reading for this week that you wanted to begin with?
Did you want us all to be muted?
Yeah, until you're ready to say something.
Well,
Anyone came in with questions? Richard.
I just wanted to make the comment that it seems that our Torah is creating moral economics. And I just wonder how practical morality is in economics and finance.
Mm-hmm. Well, apparently the Torah does have something to say about economics.
Absolutely.
And we have very little direct knowledge about how much of the Torah vis-a-vis economics was ever put into practice. Certainly it expresses an ideal. And one aspect of the ideal is the earth is the Lord's, right? It's not, you know, I mean, I may own something, but I'm just the temporary owner, right? I think for our purposes, that's probably the most important economic lesson. And it is a moral lesson. Yes, Anne.
The most difficult moral lesson in the Bible is the sabbatical year. You let the land lie fallow, and miraculously, it produces enough food for, 3 years. And I've heard people say today that in modern Israel, it works.
Doesn't work exactly that way. I mean, yes, it is, you know, a land of milk and honey and all that, but, you know, it wasn't that way when we got back there.
But they tell stories about the only thing that would grow that year was such and such, and it was a worthless crop. And then miraculously, it turned out that there was a terrific shortage of such and such all over the world, and it was the highest and blah, blah, blah.
Yes, yes. I'm not sure I believe all that, but clearly there, you know, there are a lot of challenges vis-a-vis the sabbatical year. There's the economic challenge. There's the fact challenge. I'm not planning to deal with that particularly tonight, but you know, thank you for putting it on the table.
Rabbi?
Yes, Lenny.
One question.
Was there a prohibition against, or did the people, did they, during the 6 years before the sabbatical, did they store away food the way Joseph did during his time? And if they did, I'm behind this week. I've just this afternoon started reading, so maybe this is in there and I haven't hit it.
Yeah.
Was there a prohibition on storing the food for those 6 years?
We really have very little knowledge of how far the Israelites carried this law into practice. There's just a lot that we don't know about that. And I personally, I'm a little bit suspicious. You know, it's not clear that most of the people knew all the laws of the Torah during the First Temple period. So, you know, it may be that this was something that was more in the way of a moral recommendation than anything else. Economically, it's it's a nice idea, and if they did it that way, Lenny, if they did it the way that Joseph did for Egypt, then maybe it worked out okay.
Well, I don't think this was an economic. This had anything to do with economics, because if you violated this law, you were not brought before the Bet Din.
Right. Yeah, there's.
I mean, you were judged in Shemayim. That's where you were.
It doesn't specifically say that it's a moral law.
Yeah, not an economic law.
Well, it doesn't specifically say that it's an economic law. So the lesson is the earth is the Lord's, and you work with that.
Yeah.
And yes, there's property, and yes, tribes and individuals get to own land, but there are tithes to be expected, and there's the sabbatical year, and so you have to work around that because the earth is the Lord's. Yes, Ann.
Besides, if you don't have a sabbatical year, the land it has to lie fallow or it'll lose its fertility.
Well, it's not clear that everybody, I'm sure that they understood certain basic agricultural practices. It's not clear that that's why they were doing it. Richard, you had a comment or a question.
I have read that the 7-year forgiveness of debts was worked around by the rabbis by saying, well, if you came to the Bet Din before the 7th year, sued for the debt, then a certain writ was issued that made the debt continue past.
I'm having trouble hearing you, Richard. Just get a little closer to your mic.
Okay. I have read that in the 7th year, the debts of people were forgiven, and that the rabbis came up with the notion that if you sued before the 7th year and got a judgment for your debt, your judgment was not released. And
That's correct.
What was the technical term?
Called?
Prose bull.
A prose bull. Okay. Prose bull. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was an institution that the rabbis invented to get around the obvious economic problem of doing away with debts.
That's right. That's right.
It's interesting. Sometimes the rabbis looked at the laws of the Torah and they said, well, nice try, God. Not going to work. And so they invented ways to get around certain things, to, shall we say, improve upon the Torah. I know that this is a notion not everybody in this room is comfortable with, so I apologize for bringing it up again. But it's, but the prose bull is like exhibit A of how the rabbis took the laws of the Torah into account. And if they didn't work out in practice, then they found a way to work around them.
That's right. The economic and financial aspects took precedence over the moral aspects. Makes sense?
Well, I don't know. I think they also felt that there was something fundamentally immoral about somebody being able to borrow money and then not have to pay it back. And therefore, there had to be a way to maintain debts. Yes, Ann. Ann, you're muted.
Okay, two things. One is that this could be a sort of a legal equivalent of why circumcision is better than non-circumcision and bread is better than wheat. What the people do is better than what the actual original thing was. But besides
That's actually a very thoughtful observation. I really like that. The fact that we're asked to improve God's creation and not just chew the wheat that we're given. So thank you for that.
Sure.
Okay, so I want to begin with a question. And I know the answer to the question may be obvious to you, but work with me for a minute. How much is a human being worth? Yes, Del. Unmute yourself. Yes. I still can't hear you, Del.
I say it depends upon the person and what they do.
So one way to evaluate the worth of a person is, it just depends on what they do. James Harden and Dr. Joachim Foster, who's treating COVID patients, which one is worth more? Yeah.
Depends on if you're in a fight.
Depends on, which fight you're fighting. Yes, Francois.
Human worth a dust.
I'm sorry?
A human being worth is a dust.
So, if I could just figure out the chemical worth, all the different things within your body. Heschel wrote about that in one of his books. It was probably written in the early 1950s. And he said that, if you just, boiled a person down to their chemicals, they'd be worth about 50 cents. So with inflation today, you'd be worth about $5. I'm sure somebody would pay at least $5 for me. Yes, Ann? Ann, you are muted.
We all know that we all have divine souls, so each of us is of infinite value, including a person in the wheelchair and an old folks home.
Okay, so Ann gives the obvious Jewish answer to the question, which is human being has infinite worth, infinite value. And why is that? Because we're created in God's image.
Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal.
And of infinite value. Infinite value. That's the normative answer, right? But if you look in our Torah, and I'm going to bring up the beginning of my sheet with these texts, you'll see here that there are laws about the worth of a human being. All right, let me pull that back. That when a man explicitly vows to the Lord to donate the equivalent worth of a human being, meaning that according to this segment of the Torah, you can assess the finite worth of a human being. And then if you make that kind of vow, the rabbis, of course, by the way, are very reluctant to have people make vows. But if you made such a vow, then, they could tell you exactly how much you had donated. Right? Yes. Go ahead, Ann. Ann? You have to remember to unmute yourselves.
Okay, am I unmuted?
No, you are unmuted now.
If you were going to sell yourself on the dock, what would you bring as a slave?
Well, clearly the rabbis had ideas about that, and the Talmud discusses it in Masechet Arakian, which deals with valuations. I'm not so interested in giving a number to that under any circumstances. I'm more, interested in the fact that the Torah allows such valuations at all, given the idea that we actually believe that human beings have infinite worth, regardless of how, of your financial status or what job you have. You're a little child sees mom or dad come into the house and say, Mommy, Daddy, how much did you earn today? That's not what happens, right? Not with my kids anyway. So on the most basic material level today, you could get a lot of money just for a kidney, right? Even though that kind of thing is illegal, right? But there is a black market for kidneys, right? And traditionally, as the Torah interprets this, the sex and the age of the individual are factors in their evaluation. Men are worth more than women. Adults are worth more than children. Adults in their prime are worth more than, people my age. Okay? And those kinds of evaluations that are based on economic worth are still fairly common today. We may say that a human being has infinite value, but we don't pay them infinitely, and there are more employment opportunities for younger people than there are for older people. Men are still paid more than women. Courts still evaluate earning power if they're assessing damages in litigation, right? So now that's not exactly referring to the worth of a human being. This is about, how much money a person would bring if he or she were a slave for sale in the marketplace in the time of the Torah. So it, goes on to list all those values for males and females of various ages. Of course, there was another situation that the rabbis had to take into consideration, and that was that frequently people were taken captive for a ransom, right? So what's the rule with that, right? Maimonides tells us, and that is based, that is certainly firmly based in the tradition. There is no religious duty more meritorious than the ransoming of captives.
Really?
That's a quote from Maimonides, right? It's right there on your screen. However, by the same token, there is a great reluctance to ransom captives for more than their value. That's what the Mishnah says in the next text here. Captives may not be ransomed for more than their value, meaning for what they could get in the marketplace, for the sake of tikkun olam. Tikkun olam we translate it differently today, but in the time of the Mishnah, tikkun olam meant the welfare, the betterment of the community. And what they meant by that here was that if you ransomed captives for more than their actual economic value, you would encourage kidnapping, right? So the rabbi said, we want to keep that down to a minimum. We don't want to give anybody more incentive to do that than they might already have. Okay? Yes, Ann?
They still say that today when our people get kidnapped from Israel.
Exactly. So, thank you for leading into one of the next issues we have to talk about, which is, how much are you willing to pay to ransom a captive? Think of how much the state of Israel paid to get back Gilad Shalit, right? And was that a good decision? Was it a halachic decision? Anybody have a comment on that?
That's such a hard call. You think of his parents, and you think of what if they start kidnapping more guys?
Yes. So the general tendency historically in Israel has been to be willing to pay a significant ransom, if not monetarily, at least in releasing prisoners, in order to ransom a captive. But we don't know if it will always be so in Israel. The consensus may change on that. Right? So we do want to be careful about stimulating captives. Let me go back to the study guide, and let's take a look at this piece from the Talmud, from Masechet Gittin. What does the Mishnah mean by tikkun olam? Is it because of the burden which may be imposed upon the community? If you're actually going to pay this, if you have to pay it more than once, especially, then that can become a serious financial burden on the community, or because we may stimulate kidnappers to further activity. So the Gemara says, come in here, meaning they're going to tell you about an actual case. Levi ben Darga ransomed his daughter for the huge sum of 13,000 gold denarii. Whatever it is, that's a lot of money, right? So he wasn't concerned about the second part, and he did it privately and not from community funds. So it's not an issue of the burden being imposed in the community, unless it stimulates further activity. Okay? Abaye said perhaps he acted against the will of the sages, and maybe he should have been concerned for that, and thus not been so willing to pay such an enormous ransom. Now, if it was one of our children, we might feel a lot more sympathy for Levi ben Darga and for his daughter. But we also don't know the circumstances and all of the dangers that might have faced the individual. And the Tosafot talk about this That's the next text here. And they say, when a captive is in mortal danger, we are to offer ransom even more than his value. And the fact is that you can almost always assume that a captive is in mortal danger. So, makes these kinds of decisions extremely difficult, very challenging, not only for communities, but for rabbis as well. Anyone else have a comment or a question?
I have
Yes,
one.
Del.
I really liked Abraham's idea for dealing with kidnappers. When Abraham went and rescued Lot,
Yes. Put himself on the line.
and took the word of the captors.
Mm-hmm. And
Took the
was
what?
and was willing to extend to take his own personal risk in order to free his nephew. Yeah. Richard, did you have a comment?
What we're talking about here reminded me of what one of my partners many, many decades ago, and my partner was an Episcopalian, a very, very good Episcopalian, told me.
As opposed to those rotten Episcopalians.
Let me tell you, Church of the Good Shepherd in Austin, Texas, that was the place. Anyway, by the way, this partner is now a United States District Judge. He told me something in the early 70s or mid 70s. He said, you know, we have a saying in our church that it's easy to be Jesus on the day they're not crucifying him. And which reminded me, it's easy for us as a community, as rabbis, scholars to say, well, we shouldn't pay the ransom, but to the family, and especially to families who have wealth. To the families, this is something that is so personal that I'm not so sure that the comments of the rabbis are fair. These are very, very personal decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Ann.
In Israel, they have a law against capital punishment except for Holocaust. That was a bad idea because it means that people who have committed many, many murders because they're at war against Israel get imprisoned. They don't get executed. And that means that you can demand their release. If they got executed, it couldn't be released. That was a bad idea, having
So, Ann, I know that you are familiar with the rabbinic discussion about capital punishment, that there were rabbis who said,
yes,
you know, if we had been in the Sanhedrin, nobody would ever have been put to death.
yeah.
And the response to that was, you know, you guys would multiply murderers in Israel. And that debate continues. Right?
Yep, and they're both right.
And they are both right. You know, which is, you know, when you have right on both sides, that's when the law is very sticky. And it's very difficult to legislate for a society. So, you know, we understand that those are some of the challenges we have to deal with. Right? Other comments or questions before we go on? Okay, so let me bring back the text and presto. Right? So here is the comment of Rabbi Caro in the Shulchan Aruch, which says, captives may not be ransomed for more than their value, for the sake of tikkun olam, so that the kidnappers will not be encouraged to kidnap others. But one may ransom himself using all possible means, and one may offer a large ransom for a Torah scholar or even a sharp student with the potential for greatness. Right? So, you know, those Torah scholars, though, they're definitely worth a lot. Right? Plus, if it's you, and you are the one who has to pay for your own freedom, you have latitude, right? The law allows you to pay, you know, more than you normally would. Right? And you know, so many many Jews consider the Shulchan Aruch to be the most authoritative code of Jewish law, and therefore, you know, at least as codes go, that would be the standard. The problem, of course, is that codes aren't necessarily the last word in Jewish law. They're only the last word the day that they're published. After that, you know, there may be new circumstances and new conditions that apply that didn't apply when the code was written. Next piece. It's okay. Okay. So there was a very famous case in the 13th century of a well-known rabbi who was taken into prison. And this was the Rabbi Meir of Rothenberg, who in his time was probably the foremost halachic scholar, 13th century Germany. And so the community was ready to pay the large ransom. But Rabbi Meir got word out to the community, don't do it. If I was ransomed, then all Torah scholars would be in jeopardy. He may also have been concerned that it would just be setting a bad precedent. He may also have been concerned about the financial effect on the community if this were to be repeated. But nonetheless, according to Rabbi Luria, who reports on his responsum on this matter, and the view that he got out was, don't do it because you're going to risk having other Torah scholars be taken captive. Right? Other comments or questions up to here?
He's the one we always hear about.
The Maharam, Rabbi Meir of Rothenberg. Well, if we had lived back then, he'd be the one you'd be hearing from. Okay, back to the texts. And here is a thought from one of the leading Hasidic rabbis right around the turn of the 18th, 19th century. And he points out that this section on valuations comes right after the chapter in Behar-Bechukotai, which is the Tochacha, the series of curses and threats. And when you hear the Tochacha, you might be disheartened. You might say, well, you know, what am I really worth? And therefore, says the Seer of Lublin, the Torah immediately reassures us that every person indeed does have some value. Right? And maybe there are times when it's important for us to remember that we do have value. Right? There are times when we might be very depressed, and we might feel that, we're not contributing anything to the world. I'm not sure what I'm contributing to the world today in the time of coronavirus, right? And I'm sure there's a lot of people who feel like, what am I doing about this? What am I, I'm just, kind of cowering in my home and not really contributing anything to anyone else. The Seer of Lublin would say, even when it appears that you're totally worthless, even when you've undergone tochacha, rebuke, or curses like coronavirus, nonetheless, every person indeed does have some value. I thought that was a helpful thought, because undoubtedly there are many folks who, under current circumstances, might not see themselves as having a purpose, might not see themselves as having the kind of worth that Judaism would appropriate to all of us. Okay. Comments or questions?
Well, we're not supposed to go out, the people 60 and over, we're not supposed to be going out and volunteering at the food bank or handing out things and other masks to people.
Right.
We're the
Lenny,
ones who are not.
Lenny, you don't look a day over 58.
Well,
I agree. I was very stressed out over the fact that I was told that I could not volunteer for the food bank because I'm 74 and the cutoff age was 65.
Yeah. So,
I don't see the reasoning. I'm sorry. I know that people trying to protect me, but while everybody's trying to protect me, I feel that I don't really need to be protected.
well, I won't make a judgment about whether people over a certain age need to be protected. The only point I want to stress here is how important it is that even under these circumstances, we nevertheless stress the infinite value of an individual. Yes, Ann?
Well, when the rabbi preached last weekend and she spoke about helping at the food bank,
Right.
it sounded to me as if she was scolding those of us who were not helping at the food bank, and that there is no excuse, and that we should have been there too, even if we are over whatever age it is.
Yeah.
It sounded like that to me.
I didn't hear it that way. She was with a group, and she was not saying that everybody should be there, everybody should be doing that kind of thing.
She said people
On the
were giving her
contrary,
these excuses.
I certainly understood that, she wasn't saying that to me.
Good.
So, question, Rabbi. So, this kind of being helping in food banks, any sort of, and there's plenty of opportunities. So, if people want to do that, we're supposed to do it anytime. Not in a pandemic, we're risking our own health, especially as the rabbi mentioned
Right, they took extreme measures.
Mentioned many people can't go, like they can.
Right.
They can actually die. They will. I've been to too many people's shiva here and in New York, and it's really disheartens you. And you see these people, and many of them, not all of them are actually elderly, not all. So what you see in the news, what you see in the numbers, they are correct. And there is no doubt, if you get sick, the chances are slim.
Yeah.
Rabbi,
Because we don't know what we're
Well,
dealing with, right?
well, I mean, Yeah, the numbers actually, are the odds are you will recover from the coronavirus. The number of deaths, even so, is pretty staggering. Daniel, you were raising your hand.
Yes, I was. So if we're going to talk about this, the value that you bring to going to a food bank, if your immune system is low and you catch COVID and you go out and you give it to 3 of your friends, the value that you've provided to your community is lessened.
It's a negative value.
It's a negative value.
Yeah.
So it's not about us as older people. It's about the fact that we are more likely to contract the virus and give it to other people.
Right. So that is why all of this has to be taken into consideration when you decide who can go to the food bank or who can come to the synagogue. There are synagogues where, they have arranged a minyan within their building with all proper social distancing, but limited to those under a certain age.
Well, my real point, though, Rabbi, is that instead of us thinking about how can I feel good about myself, it's how can I behave in a way that will protect other human beings and their value.
Yes. And I think a lot of the discussion in society today needs to be kind of reframed in that way, so that, what do you mean I have to wear a mask, right? Or, what do you mean I can't open my business, right? It's about what do we need to provide what society needs for the greater good, for the health of the community. I'm not in the least saying that I have any of the answers to those questions, but I think those are the operative questions. Hey, Lenny.
When we're talking right now about the value of a person, we're talking about practical, here and now, on the ground situations. But I read somewhere, I think it was an excerpt about Gemara. So you're the authority here. You'll tell me. Our true value is not really determined in this world. That there are 7 layers, 7 areas of heaven, and that the highest level is the higher you go up in the different levels of heaven, determines what your worth was,
right,
while you were alive.
Yeah.
If you go to the highest, to the 7th level, which I think is called Aravos, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, that is supposedly the level where Hashem resides. And so this is how you can tell what a person is worth. Mm-hmm. And by his actions that's where the final determination is. Well, are you on level 1, level 3, or level 7? So is this from the Gemara or am I?
Yeah, I don't remember whether it's actually in the Talmud or in the Midrash, but I've heard that too. I would stress, by the way, that it's not necessarily a dogma in Judaism that there are 7 levels of heaven. But I think that a teaching like that certainly conveys the idea that your real worth is not determined in this world.
Right.
Right? Your real worth, as some people like to say, is determined by your receipts. and not by your balance.
Right.
Um, let me go to Ann because I know you've been waiting. Go ahead.
Okay, back to the coronavirus. You know, the restaurants are closed, and I don't want them to go out of business. So I feel I have to buy something once a week and have company. And so it's hard. Are they starting to open now that whatever it is that happened last weekend?
Yeah, some of the restaurants here in Houston have opened, and some are still, using all abundant caution.
What about Genesis? What about
Genesis is open.
It's open. We don't have to.
They do have some social distancing in place, but they are open.
What's the one next, right on the corner of Racewood and Chimney Rock on the other side of the bio?
Abba's Grill and Walk. I'm not sure if they are completely open or if they are still just doing takeout.
And then the one
I know they're
further
open.
west. The one a little bit further west.
You're thinking of Dino's?
Yes.
Yeah. As far as I don't know because I have not been there since the rest.
I tried to take turns with them, so that I'll survive.
If anyone wants more details about the restaurants and such, the kosher restaurants, by all means, ask me afterwards, send me an email. But I certainly endorse the idea that, we want to provide a little business to institutions that we want to remain as part of our community. Right? And I've put that in writing previously too.
Saba Grill is open and they're doing a tremendous business. You got to call in, and it's a wait when you call in to get your order. So, but they're open, doing great.
Yeah.
You mean people come and eat there?
I've just picked up. We've only picked up from there.
Yeah.
So I think
that's all I've done with him. Let me go back to our texts, and here give you an excerpt from Rabbi Kushner in our Eitz Chaim Chumash, who wrote, "How do we measure the value of a person? The world at large values rich people more than poor people, etc., etc. In God's temple, however, people are evaluated b'shekel hakodesh, by the sanctuary weight, as this translation gives. In other words, that the same thing that you're teaching, the teaching you quoted, Lenig, is that God views our worth differently than the world does.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Next, right? Another piece from the Talmud. A certain person came to one of the sages named Rabbi and said, "The Lord of my place said to me, go kill so-and-so. If you don't, I will kill you." Rabbi said, "Better he should kill you and you should not kill. Who's to say that your blood is redder than the other person's? Maybe that man's blood is not redder." Right? So, again, in this world, from God's viewpoint, or from the sage's viewpoint, certainly, there's no determining the value of one individual. It doesn't say that their value is infinite, but it's as if that were the case. Let me just take a look here. Anyone else have a question, comment? Go ahead, Ann.
There are lots of stories like this one. The Baal Shem Tov said, who in this marketplace is worth the most in the next world? And he was directed to a couple of gestures because they made people happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, next
So
text.
tell it.
All right. I share this from one of my colleagues in Florida, Rabbi Michael Gold. And this is something he wrote before the pandemic, right? When, people might be, if you could go to the cemetery at all, you might be spending a lot more time there. He says, as a rabbi, I spend too much time at cemeteries. And I wander around and I read the stones, and I don't see headstones that read doctor, lawyer, stockbroker, accountant, teacher, truck driver, because our ultimate value is in the sphere of relationships, right? What of the person who's alone, who has no family, no friends, no loved ones? What worth does such a person have? Therefore, the psalm says, though my father and my mother abandon me, the Lord will take me in. That's a verse some of you know from the psalm that we say during the period of the days of awe. Right? And Rabbi Gold says, even someone who feels alone and rejected has infinite worth in the eyes of God. Right? Which is a reminder to us that we need to be, sensitive to those who may feel that they're abandoned, and make sure that we treat them as someone who has infinite worth. Right? Next piece. Right? The last piece, actually, from the 20th century Gera Rabbi, Rabbi Pinchas Menachem Alter. Why are these laws found here? And why is a person's worth based on his age? A 20-year-old ignoramus is valued at more than a 120-year-old Moshe. That doesn't seem right. But he says the laws of Arakian, of valuation, follow the tochacha. And here, this sort of echoes what we saw back above in the teaching. I just passed it. The teaching of the Seer of Lublin, right? The one that one might become disheartened and deem oneself to be totally worthless. Here, the Israelites themselves, after hearing the rebuke, might have been dispirited. Therefore, they were told, every Jew has value. Do not let your spirits fall. In addition, these laws, as with all the laws concerning vows, teach the power of speech. A person says certain words, and they are then obligated to take certain actions. So too, the power of speech is powerful enough to enable us to pray and repent and thereby avoid the punishments contained in the rebuke, in the tochacha. And why is a person's worth determined by his age? To remind us of the value of time and that a person's true worth depends on how he uses his time. So there are a few good and interesting lessons for us to take home from that. Comments or questions here?
The reference to time here, is it reference in regards to if you're spending it, or what is the reference? Is it if you're a Torah scholar? I'm just
The
thinking
part
that's what
about
is.
age. The part about age is in the text of the Torah. Right? So, basically it was just, your value if you were sold in a slave market. Well, You know, you would get more for someone who was 20 years old. Because you have potentially a lot more work out of them than you would get out of me. Yes, anyone else? Okay. I kept you a little bit late last week. I'll let you go a few minutes early tonight. Everyone have a good Shabbat, and hope to see you all next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good night.
Good Shabbos.